hi, Lauren. Since early 2015, Lauren Simpson has spent her spare time transforming her Houston home garden into a pollinator-friendly habitat. Currently, it's a certified wildlife habitat with the National Wildlife Federation, a monarch way station, and a certified butterfly garden from the North American Butterfly Association. She promotes pollinator conservation and wildscaping through presentations, events, interviews, and she's got a website as well as an educational Facebook community entitled St. Julian's Crossing Wildlife Habitat, which is the name for their adopted family's monarch's way station. Ms. Simpson is a member of the Native Plant Society of Houston, Texas. The Native Plant Society of Texas, the Houston chapter, and the North American Butterfly Association, which is a butterfly enthusiast of Southeast Texas chapter. She's also received level 1 and level 2 certifications through the Native Plant Society of Texas Native Landscape Certification Program. She's attended the Monarch Conservation Workshop for Train the Trainer training, and she serves on that NPSOT subcommittee for their Native Landscape Certification level 4. She has got a whole world of experience here she's going to share with us today. Ms. Simpson is also a clinical associate professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where she teaches lawyering skills and strategies. She's a spring 2016 recipient of the University of Houston Teaching Excellence Award, one of 3 2018 AALS Teachers of the Year selected by the Law Center, and in 2017, 18, 19, and 2021, the Student Bar Association Professor of the Year for Law Center faculty teaching in the part-time program. She's a busy lady, and in the meantime, she gives her time to teach us about pollinator gardens. So today, Lauren is going to be talking about creating a pollinator paradise for neighbors that you will love. And we're going to give you just a brief overview here. So the average neighborhood yard may look pretty, but it doesn't support the wide range of wildlife that a healthy environment and community needs. The good news is that yards can be both beautiful and beneficial by incorporating the native plants to support our local wildlife. So in this presentation, Ms. Lauren Simpson is going to introduce our pollinators, explain some steps for creating a pollinator garden at home, and this will be for the enjoyment of your family and the benefit of your community. So we are going to learn how to transform our yards into a beautiful native plant paradise, one that supports pollinators and will please your neighbors as well. So Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Amber. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. So I really want to thank the Woodlands Township, and in particular, the Township's Environmental Services Department. Y'all, how about that Plant for Pollinators program and that Monarch Champion status? That is outstanding. I really enjoyed the overview of what you're doing up there in the woodlands. So if I can be even a little piece of that, I am honored and I am thrilled. So thank you for having me here today. So as you know, my full-time job is teaching at the University of Houston Law Center. Go Cougs, can't help it. And I teach legal research and writing to students to help them be the best lawyers that they can be. But my other hat that I wear, which is what I'm wearing today, figuratively speaking, is that I have a passion for pollinators and insects, and basically for native plant gardens in urban areas that support those insects because they bring us so much joy, but also a lot of eco services. We're going to talk briefly about those things today. So we'll spend about the next hour and 15 minutes walking through what I like to call the what, the why, and the how of gardening for pollinators. And we're going to just do really short time on the why because I think we really need to focus on the how. How do I execute it in a way that will sustain pollinators, but at the same time, help me be supportive of my neighbors. In other words, be part of the community that Amber was talking about before. So I'm going to go ahead and begin the begin, as they say, and start up the presentation. So here we go. All right. So let's talk first about the what. And I'm going to start with what a wildscape is. So a wildscape sometimes goes by different names. Some people call it a habitat garden or a wildlife habitat garden, 6 one, half dozen another. So the term that I use is wildscape. And unsurprisingly, a wildscape is a garden, the primary purpose of which is to support wildlife. what does that mean? So it really manifests itself in 3 different moments, right? So the first is my plant choice is guided by this goal. Second, my design decisions for the garden are guided by this goal. And third, my maintenance practices are guided by this goal. The good news is that even if this is my primary goal, we can also do it in ways that we'll discuss in the how part of the program that make it attractive to the community. So that's what a wildscape is. Whoops, excuse me. Feels like a Monday, y'all. All right. So I like the way that Rainier and West, and I'll show you their book later, a screenshot of their book. I like the way that they describe this kind of wildscaping in urban and suburban areas like mine down in Houston and yours in the Woodlands Township. So they call it a designed plant community and a hybrid of horticulture and ecology. So what does that mean? So it's basically a garden that takes cues from the natural area that is in our region historically, meaning for millennia. So it takes cues from nature and it translates that natural area into something that our community can read as garden. And that last point is so important because as much as I would love to have a literal Katy Prairie in my front yard here in Houston, Texas, my neighbors are probably a lot happier that it reads garden and they understand it to be that way. And therefore, in the 6 or so years I've done this, I've had nothing but universal support from my neighbors and passersby because they understand that it's, as my friend says, intended rather than untended. So that's what we're talking about with urban wildscapes. And because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I thought that I might show you some examples. I think the most important thing for me to say here is that it's a sliding scale, y'all. When I first started, understandably, I thought it was all or nothing, right? Like a binary choice. So it was either traditional landscaping or wildlife habitat landscaping, wildscaping. And that the latter always looked really wild, right? Just like the Katy Prairie, for example, in my area. But that's actually inaccurate. And I learned over time that it's more of this sliding scale, depending on your aesthetic preferences and the rules that you have in your own subdivision and area. And so one can have very, very traditional and yet still be a wildscape. I have some friends that I don't have a photo of it, unfortunately, today, but where it's very traditional looking. And that's still a wildscape that supports plants and insects and animals 100%, but it can also be very wild looking. So I would say that this garden for my friends down in Clear Lake is probably in the middle of that spectrum. Notice a couple of the techniques they use that we're going to talk about later. So whereas the middle of the gardens, the garden bed themselves is very sort of wild looking and more like what one might see driving through the prairie. Notice how they've used chunky borders. So anytime we put a border around something, it shows intention, right? Instead of neglect. And so what this is, like the general rule of thumb I give people is the wilder it is inside, the chunkier the border. And that makes it reed garden. This is from my dear friend, Jaime Gonzalez, who's with the Nature Conservancy now here in Houston. And these are examples of his home gardens. And so what you see on the right side with those 2 photographs is what he calls his family pocket prairie. And every spring, he mows his lawn and then he places clumps of sod with our native wildflower seeds in it in a really cool sort of spiral design that looks intentional. And then those little mounds that he mows around come up in wildflowers. Again, it looks intended. The photo on the left is actually of his backyard. Now, you don't see those kinds of borders of wood or stone or metal, but what you see is what we call a green border, which is a sharp delineation between the content of the bed and the yard or turf around it. And so this is a really good choice for families, for example, because it gives the kids a place to play and neighbors a place to visit, while at the same time, it allows those gardens to thrive in a way that people read as garden. This is the wildest one I'm going to show you. Now, this was a friend, this was her former house. She's not there anymore, but this was like very much on the wild end of the scale. And I find it absolutely gorgeous. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but if it is your cup of tea, that's wonderful. And so this actually does have some architectural structure. It has some arbors and some stones and some seating areas. It's just that it's hard to see because it's that very organic look. And finally, sort of in the middle of the spectrum are my home gardens here in the heart of Houston. So I'm in the northwest part of Houston. And my house is under 1,600 square feet, and the front and backyards are comparable in size. And so probably about 60% of my front yard is now landscaped into wildlife habitat. And we're over, I would guess, about over 90% of the species are native to our ecoregion. And so again, you see like on the left-hand side, a very full, thick garden bed, and we'll talk about those techniques later, but notice those thick moss stones and boulders. And in the bottom right, what you see is actually not just a path, but a swale, and that demarcates the difference between the bed and the garden. And then finally here is another couple of pictures of our garden. So again, the most important takeaway here, I think, is that it's a sliding scale, and whatever your aesthetic is, that's fine. And by the way, it doesn't have to be 60% of your yard, y'all. Anything is a great place to start. And I usually counsel people to start small. It's not a hard way to garden. It's just a different way to garden. And so it's easy to get overwhelmed if we bite off more than we can chew. And most of us are very busy with family and work and so forth. And so I would recommend starting small. This is the result of 6 years. Okay, so as another part of what, I thought it might be good to chat a bit about what pollinates in our gardens. And I'm going to focus on insect groups. So pretty much pollinators are any animal that transfers the pollen from the male component of a flower to the female component of a flower while they are there to either eat the pollen or the nectar in that flower, right? So it's really any animal. Now, bees are, everyone knows how good a pollinator a bee is, right? So they actually evolved. Just a few fun facts about bees, and there's a method to my madness, y'all. The method is that some of the things I'm telling you now, we're going to remember later when we talk about how to design our gardens and how to maintain them, okay? But for now, let's just look at some fun facts and look at these gorgeous bees. So the first thing is, did you know that there were green and blue bees? Like for real and for true, I had no idea. They come in all different colors and all different sizes. And by the way, this class is also a participatory class, and those who don't participate have to stay after class to clean the erasers. So here we go. I want you please to hold up your pinky finger, and I want you to look at the flesh tone part of your pinky finger. And now I want you to look at this central bee here. So the flesh size of your pinky finger is the size of that entire flower head. That's Texas frog fruit, or Phyllonotiflora, one of our natives. This bee is smaller than that flower head. This one is only a few millimeters big, and it's not our smallest one in North America. Now, hold up your thumb. Look at the space from the knuckle to the tip of your thumb. And that's about the size of some of the largest bees in North America, including carpenter bees. This is not one of our largest carpenter bees, but things like bumblebees and carpenter bees tend to be that good. So remember in your mind that they come in very different colors, sizes, and shapes. The other thing about our native bees is in Texas, we have about 1,100 species, and in North America, about 4,000, and the honeybee is not one of them. So the honeybee is a domesticated animal. It was brought over from Europe, for example, to make honey, and it's gotten out and it's feral, but it's not one of our native bees. And so kind of keep those things in mind along with this key fact. Bees feed on nectar, not pollen, and they feed with a tongue, sometimes longer or shorter. So let's talk briefly about butterflies. And by the way, before I forget, y'all, I forgot to tell you, these photos all come from my home wildlife habitat garden, unless they're otherwise marked. I take these pictures with my cell phone. This biodiversity is possible. We are now up, speaking of butterflies, to 51 documented species of butterfly in our home gardens in the heart of Houston. So if you build it, they'll come. So these are actual critters from our gardens. So butterflies are also pollinators. The adults feed on nectar, and they use an appendage called a proboscis. Although it does have a channel in the middle, fun fact, it's actually more like a sponge. It functions a lot through capillary action. And generally speaking, these butterflies are not quite as good pollinators as our bees. Bees have evolved to have that really thick fur to carry pollen because their babies feed on pollen. Butterflies actually have longer legs and a longer proboscis, and so it's generally probably usually their legs and their proboscis that touches the pollen. But they are beautiful, aren't they? Moths are in the same order as butterflies, order Lepidoptera. And fun fact, Lepidoptera means scale wing. And any fuzz that you see on a moth or a butterfly is not hair, y'all. It's actually specialized scales, which blows my mind. Moths also feed with a proboscis. They sometimes are fuzzier than butterflies. Sometimes they're smaller, and so maybe they might pollinate a little better. Many are nocturnal, but many that you see here are feeding during the day, and we call that diurnal. And now this is what really blew my mind when I started looking into this stuff. So I had no idea that flies could pollinate. So flies are actually not bad pollinators. They're pretty darn good depending on the fly. So fly adults eat nectar and a few eat pollen. And even though they tend not to be fuzzy like bees, they have very shallow mouth parts. So it comes out on a little stalk and it's like a little sponge. And that means they have to get really close to the flower to feed usually. Not all flies, but most of them. And so they're rubbing their little bodies against those pollen sources and transferring them to the female component of the flower. So they're actually pretty darn good. And certain flies, for example, the one in the top right, the one in the middle right, and the two in the bottom, well, take that back, top right, middle right, and bottom left. These are all examples of what we call hoverflies. They're in the family Syrphidae or hoverflies. And not all, but many of those flies in the hoverfly family, of the four I have here, these three, or five hoverflies, these three, have larvae that are predaceous. And what does that mean? It means that their babies eat things like whiteflies, mealybugs, lacewings, scale, aphids, all that stuff that eats our gardens, right? And so they are actually those particular flies, of a very healthy garden. And depending on the species, a single larva of a hoverfly can consume 200 to 400 aphids before it pupates. So that's pretty powerful. Wasps. So who knew that wasps are pollinators? Again, they tend not to be as good a pollinator as bees because they're not as fuzzy, but they do feed with tongues, and primarily the adults are feeding on nectar and maybe some pollen. But unlike bees, their babies don't eat pollen. Almost exclusively, their babies eat other insects. And so the mama wasps are very good at stinging those things like aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, and things like that. In addition to caterpillars, they sting them, paralyze them, and stalk their baby's larder with them. And other wasps lay their eggs inside those hosts. And then when they hatch, they consume those other insects. And so, yes, they do eat my butterfly caterpillars, but in the wild, only about 1 out of every 100 butterfly eggs becomes an adult. And I'm okay with that because these wasps are the primary reason I haven't used pesticides in 6 years. I don't need to because they take care of it for me. So I'm one with wasp, y'all. Plus, look how gorgeous they can be, right? And finally, what I like to call the catch-all, the 4 Bs: beetles, bugs, bats, and hummingbirds. So basically, any critter that feeds on nectar or pollen and thereby in that process transfers stuff, okay? All right. So very briefly, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on why we need wildscapes, just very, very quickly. So first of all, insects bring us a lot of eco-services. And there was this great study about 15 years ago that looked at sort of the what would the economic value of the eco-services that are native insects, not honeybees, that our native insects bring us just in the US, and I think it was continental US. And they estimated, by the way, they said it was a low estimate, but at a minimum, $60 billion a year. And that was 15 years ago. So what kind of services do they bring us? Super fast. So they pollinate. So about 2/3 of our crops in the United States require pollination by an animal. So they don't self-pollinate and they're not wind pollinated. And so our native pollinators are a huge part of that equation. Likewise, depending on the study that you read, about 75 to 95% of flowering plants worldwide have to have some kind of animal pollinate them. They're not wind or self-pollinated. Likewise, insects are a huge part of the food chain. So not only indirectly by pollinating things that then produce seeds, berries, and fruits that other creatures higher up in the food chain can eat, but directly. Because insects are really, really good at converting the energy into plants into protein and depending on the insect, fats and other nutrients. And so they're a big part of the diet of some critters. And just to give you one example, about 96% of our terrestrial bird species in, I think it's in North America, maybe worldwide, I think it's North America, about 96%, their chicks can eat only insects and other arthropods. They cannot digest nuts, berries, and grains like many of their adults can. And they need quite a lot. And so Dr. Doug Tallamy talks about in his books that that are mentioned here at the bottom, but I'll talk about later. He talks about studies where they tried to figure the number. And so they studied Carolina chickadees, for example, and a single mama for a single clutch in a single season needs not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of insects and other arthropods to feed her babies. Thousands. So if we don't have insects, we can't feed our baby birds in our area. Likewise, they bring us a lot of decomposition services, so dung, carrion, plant matter, and they're a huge part of the pest control equation. So like I mentioned, wasps and flies, there are other bugs that do the same, and beetles and so on and so forth. And it's to the tune of about $4.5 billion a year. So they provide a lot of services. The thing is that, as Amber was mentioning earlier, insects, pollinators, which are a subset, right? But insects in general are in a world of hurt right now. And so we could spend a week on this, and there are conferences that do spend a week on this by people who are much more qualified than I. But you can see some of the highlights of these drivers of insect decline. A key among them are habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. And so it's really heartening to hear how the Woodlands is trying to bring that back in our individual gardens, right? So when the habitat is lost, like this was all coastal prairie in my area before, and woodlands in part of your area. And when we moved in, we removed that, and then we started replacing it, as you see on the bottom, with non-native plants, in part because some of those plants are chosen because nothing here has evolved to eat them. And so if nothing eats them, they're not doing their job. So between that and pesticides and herbicides, climate change, light pollution that we bring in, they're in a world of hurt. And I will tell you that right now, entomologists are still studying the overall loss of insect biomass and diversity and so forth. There's a lot more studying to go. There are a lot of gaps in their knowledge, but they are taking off their white coats right now and coming out of their laboratories in the midst of their research to tell us, y'all, that it's a huge problem and we need to act now, and we need to act at all levels: national, international, state, local, like the Woodlands is doing, and individual. And when scientists do that in the middle of studying, you know it's serious. And so the only thing I'll mention here is something from a series of articles from Manga Bay News back in June of 2019. So it's a couple of years old now. And they interviewed 24 entomologists from 6 different continents, representing 12 different countries, and they asked them a single question. On a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being no problem and 10 being dire emergency, right, dire situation, how would you rate the crisis in insect abundance? No one said below 8, and some said 10. And so it's complicated and complex, and we don't know all the data yet, but scientists are asking us to act. So how can we help pollinators and other insects? So I don't know about you, but I need a rejoice and be glad moment after that slide a couple of slides ago with that sort of Debbie Downer news, because there's no way to sugarcoat it. So here's the rejoice and be glad moment. Right here, right now, right in our own gardens, we form a critical link in the chain that will save insects and thus the ecosystem. Right here, right now, right at home. And you know, a chain is only as good as each of its links. So I'm not going to pretend that we don't need to act at different levels too. We need to do what we can to affect the change that we think is the right one to affect at the international, national, state, local, like Woodlands, as y'all are doing, and individual levels. We can't abdicate that responsibility. But sometimes that is less direct at those higher levels than at the individual level. So let's flip that, y'all. We are a critical link in our home gardens. What we do matters, and the chain can't function without us. Now that is motivating. Like, I don't know about you, but that and a cup of coffee gets me going in the morning, right? What empowerment it is, how empowering it is to know that what we do in our gardens can be both beautiful and supportive and help make up for those pressures on insects and thus help save our ecosystem. And so when we do that, in the words of some of these researchers, in our individual gardens, y'all, we create what some of them call stepping stones for these critters. Others, like Dr. Doug Tallamy, I'll show you his books in a minute, call them biological corridors. So remember, we talked about how habitat fragmentation and degradation by putting cement and different kinds of plants and stuff into our habitat after we fragment it is a problem. Well, we fix that when we give stepping stones in our gardens for these little critters. So that teeny little bee I showed you that's only about 2 to 3 millimeters big, it can't get from my house to the center of town to Memorial Park, but it can darn sure get from my house to my next door neighbor's blanket flower. And then 2 houses down to my other neighbor's scarlet sage. And so when we do this, we create those stepping stones. And I just want to share one quotation from Dr. Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, because I love this one. To succeed, we do not need to invoke governmental action. We do not need to purchase large tracts of pristine habitat that no longer exist. We do not need to limit ourselves to sending money to national and international conservation organizations and hoping it will be used productively. Our success is up to each one of us individually. We can each make a measurable difference almost immediately by planting a native plant nearby. As gardeners and stewards of our land, we have never been so empowered, and the ecological stakes have never been so high. And in his most recent book that I'll show you in a minute, Dr. Tallamy calls this homegrown national park. Isn't that cool? So let's figure out, let's move on now to the how. What concrete steps can I take to convert my gardens into that kind of wildscape, small or large, that will be one of those stepping stones in a biological corridor and part of homegrown national park, in Dr. Tallamy's words. Okay, so I'm going to do this in a series of tips, y'all, but first I want to recommend some books. So there are 3 that I'm going to recommend in particular. And I'm going to tell you they're sort of targeted at different levels of experience. So I'll explain that. So on the left, what you see is Dr. Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark's book called The Living Landscape. So if I have less experience gardening, I want to start with this book. So Dr. Tallamy is an entomologist, I forget at which university, and he writes and speaks on this all the time. He's so engaging, and his books are so easy to read. So Dr. Tallamy has paired with Rick Dark, who's a landscaper using native plant techniques, and they have written this book to explain how to do it. And by the way, I just realized I left out the slide in this presentation recommending Dr. Tallamy's books. So here they are. His one that's over 10 years old is called Bringing Nature Home. Fantastic book. And then he wrote one that published last February as a follow-up to that. And it's called Nature's Best Hope. If I could recommend only 2 of those 2 books on the why of wildscaping, I would recommend those. And if you can get only one, I would recommend the later one, Nature's Best Hope, from last year. So now back to where we are. As the French say, revenons à nos moutons. Let's go back to our sheep. So now we're talking about the how of wildscaping. On the right-hand side, you see that Rainier and West book I quoted from before earlier. It's called Planting in a Post-Wild World. So I'd say this is probably like medium level of gardener, although if you're a beginner, you can still use it as well. It has great design techniques. I will say about this book that they do not limit their advice just to actual natives to an ecoregion. They go beyond that to things that function well in an area as opposed to being native to it historically. But they recognize that you get more bang for the buck with native, and everything they tell you is totally workable. I've used their techniques in my garden. And then finally, oh my gosh, I love this book so much. This is like above my pay grade in skill level, but I have it and I digest it bit by bit because it's got so much detail and help. So this is probably the highest level. It's called Garden Revolution, and it has transformed how I do certain methods of my gardening, like what I use instead of mulch now, and so on and so forth. So great books. Okay, just like if I could give you only 1 or 2 books on the why of wildscaping, if I could give you just one of these tips, I would give you this tip. So this is support the home team. And by support the home team, I mean plant plants in your garden that are native to our particular area of Texas. So plant native plants. So surprisingly, actually, I did not realize this until a few years back. The idea of what a native plant is actually a point of some debate among folks. And so there are different ways of thinking of it. So I like Dr. Doug Tallamy's way of explaining it in Bringing Nature Home. He talks about plants having historical evolutionary relationships with a particular wildlife community, right? And I'll explain that in a moment. So if you parse that out, it's really got 3 components to it. So first, time. The plant has been growing there for a long time, not hundreds of years, but millennia, in order that it be able to adapt and co-evolve with other things. So there's that idea of millennia, long time. Second, there's an idea of place. The plant's been there for millennia. In other words, in a location where it has evolved to adapt to particular, not criteria, I can't think of the word for it, but to the particular things in that area. So rainfall, soil, sunlight, right? And finally, there's that idea of community. A native plant is nothing that we can conceive of in the abstract in Dr. Tallamy's view, and I agree with him. You know, something that's native in Australia is not native here, right? So it's the idea of it has grown or developed and evolved in that place over millennia with other plants and animals so that they have co-evolved to use each other. That's the key. And so we want to plant those plants that other things here, flora and fauna, have co-evolved with. So I like his understanding of it, and that's how I kind of view it. So this is from the EPA. It's a little bit small to see, but if you look, we are in the northern humid Gulf coastal prairies ecosystem. So right about this area here, Montgomery County and Harris County in this area. And so, what I do, well, let me say this. The way that the environment is here in the Panhandle is very different from how it is here in the El Paso area, is very different from what it is in the Hill Country or very south of Texas, or where we are in this part of Texas, nearer to the coast and the piney woods. And so we have different rain, soil, right? Different creatures, right? And so the idea is when we purchase plants, we don't want to purchase just those that are Texas natives. We want to purchase those that are native to our area of Texas, because something that's adapted to grow up in the bone dry conditions around Lubbock, for example, may not do as well here. And maybe it'll feed the same kinds of critters. Maybe it won't. I don't know, 100%. It might do some. I don't have to study all of it. I just have to know that I want to, for multiple reasons that are practical and historical, I want to focus on those things that are native to my part of Texas. So I'm going to tell you a really good trick and rule of thumb. So we all know nurseries that are local, both in the Montgomery County and down here in Harris County, that tend to specialize in some plants that are native. And so those nurseries, most of them, not all of them, but most of them have non-native species and native species because they're a retail business. And so they're supplying for any kind of gardener. And so sometimes you'll see areas that say Texas native. So sometimes those Texas natives are native to our area of Texas, y'all, and sometimes they're not. So here's the trick. So I never go to any nursery unless I have my little pocket computer, my cell phone. And whenever I see a plant that looks interesting, I type in the Latin name of it. So, you know, whatever the genus and species is. So the Latin binomial, and then one of two acronyms, either USDA or BONAP, B-O-N-A-P. And this will take me to a map where it breaks down the native status by county in the state. On the USDA one, you have to zoom in a little bit to get those county divisions. So counties are not quite the same as ecosystem, but it gets us in the zone, y'all. So that's what I do. And as my plants die and I replace them, my rule of thumb is I replace them only with plants that are native to my particular part of Texas. So why do we want to do this? And I think that's a fair question. Like, why can't I just plant something from all around the world, right? And it's not that you can't. Remember, I'm about 8–10% non-native. Nothing in there is invasive, but you know, until I win the lottery, I'm not going 100% native in my gardens. And some of those things I just like, and they're not invasive. So I have them. But the more you have plants that have co-evolved with animals in your area, the more likely those animals have co-evolved to consume the chemicals in them. And let's talk insects for a minute. So some of these studies down here and these sources talk about data that shows that about 90% of our insects are plant feeding insects, or what we call specialists at some point in their development. So what does this mean? This means that they can feed only on plants in a particular family, genus, or even species. Primarily, this is things like leaf-eating insects, but not uniquely. There are some bees who have babies that can feed, that are specialists on only a certain pollen in a certain family, genus, or species of plant. And so the most common one of these is that we know is the monarch, right? And so what do monarch caterpillars eat? Well, they eat milkweed, and milkweed's in the genus Asclepius. And so they're an example at the larval phase of an insect that's a specialist. And so about 90% of ours are. So if an insect has not co-evolved with a plant, it may not be able to digest the chemicals in the leaf or pollen. This is especially true the farther away we get from our area of North America, South America, Central America, Africa, Europe, Asia. The farther away we get, the less likely it is, although it's not always 100% true, that they're able to eat it. Now, I'm not going to pretend that our native insects cannot eat any non-native plants. So for example, the eastern black swallowtail butterfly, those caterpillars eat dill, fennel, parsley, and rue. Those are native to Europe and other areas, not to here. But they have natives also that they feed on. So they can, but the studies seem to indicate, and they're only just starting to come out, that ecosystems dominated by non-native plants tend to have reduced insect, as the study says, diversity, abundance, and biomass. And you see the 2018 study down there that says that. And so I get more bang for the buck as a layperson who doesn't know all these things inherently. I know I'm getting more bang for the buck the more native plants that I plant. And so I want to include those in my wildscape. And by the way, as I intimated before, one of the reasons that a lot of landscaping choices, plant choices, are things that are not native to our area and are not edible by our creatures here is because they're not edible by our creatures here. So they're pest free. The problem is, and to paraphrase Dr. Tallamy, if an insect's not eating something, it's not doing its job really. Or a plant's not feeding something, it's not doing its job really. So we want to make sure we welcome those insects. They're also, generally speaking, hardier in our climate. Now, it's not universal, but generally speaking. And so if I have a plant that's not used to our, being drowned in the summer and drowned in the spring and nuked in the summer, it may either end up with rotted roots or just withering away in the heat of the drought in our summertime, if it's from an area that is more tropical and lush. And so I found right away that when I converted to primarily plants that are native, and I chose them to be native plants that are drought tolerant. When I did that, I seriously cut down on my water consumption. So I'm saving money and I'm saving resources. I actually don't own a sprinkler. We don't have a sprinkler system and I don't own a sprinkler. I spot water with a hose as needed. And there are some plants that I'll show you today at the end that I just don't water. I don't need to because they've acclimated here over eons. So it's not that it's always true, but if something has evolved here, and I choose it because it's drought tolerant to my area, then that means I water it less. And it also means I spend less money replacing my plants. It's also okay if our native plants get out because they were always here. And that's true of aggressive native plants. Doesn't matter if they get out of my garden. The problem comes when we have a non-native aggressive plant that nothing here has evolved to eat. When those get out, like this Chinese tallow tree, that can be hugely problematic because now they have an advantage over our native plants that critters here have evolved to eat. The Chinese tallow is responsible for destroying some parts of prairie remnants. It is aggressive. I don't know anything that eats the leaf. It is assertive and it shades out our prairie natives. So it's not that every non-native plant is invasive. It's just if it's aggressive and nothing else can eat it. And so I'm going to give you a list of some that organizations like the Houston Audubon Society's invasive list and others might be in our gardens. I had one or two of these in my garden and I didn't know they were considered invasive. Chinese tallow, Bradford pear, Nandina, which is also called heavenly bamboo. And by the way, those pretty orange red berries of Nandina, they actually have a cyanide compound in them and they kill birds. Birds eat them and they die from it. Ligustrum, elephant ear, pampas grass, Chinese privet, and yes, Japanese honeysuckle. There's almost always a native equivalent that's just as beautiful. And even if aggressive, doesn't matter if it gets out. So that was my main tip. So let's go and walk through a few others that can be helpful. So the next tip I have is avoid pesticides. It's pretty self-explanatory. So instead, welcome predators, insects and otherwise, and parasitoids, which lay their eggs inside another insect for a healthy garden. So I'm going to give you just one example. So think about how many of you have milkweed, and think about those yellow oleander aphids that are all over our milkweed. So they really can cover it sometimes. I actually don't squish mine or hose them off or use soap on them or pesticides or anything. And here's why I don't. Because that honeydew, that sticky stuff that they exude, will attract the adult insects that either themselves will feed on it. So like lady beetles, for example, will feed on them themselves, or that have larvae, their babies, feed on them. So things like lacewings, some of those hoverflies that I showed you. And so on the top row here, you see arrows pointing to what looks like a cross between a slug and a caterpillar. Those are actually hoverfly larvae, two different species. And to the right of this one, that's what we call a puparium. That's like the chrysalis for butterflies, the pupal phase, that's theirs. And so, like I said, these little guys can suck up 200 to 400 aphids, depending on the species, before they pupate. That's great. Here, I have a lady beetle larva directly eating one of those aphids. So the adults and babies eat those, also lacewings. And this is a horrible photo, y'all, apologies. But this is a teeny tiny mama wasp ovipositing or laying her egg inside a bee blossom aphid. Pretty cool. So I let things go in cycles. It just takes patience. So we'll have like 2 weeks where they're covered by aphids. Then the predators and parasitoids come. and then they eat the rest. They eat them, and then I have nothing for 2 weeks, right? No aphids. So just be patient, and nature should take care of it. Tip 3, mix it up. So variety is the spice of life, and it also makes for a really healthy habitat garden. And why? Because as we saw in the what portion, pollinators come in all shapes and sizes. Method to the madness. Some feed with tongues. The tongues can be longer or shorter. Some feed with a shorter or longer proboscis. Some have spongy, shallow mouth parts, for example. Some are big and need a landing pad. Some are teeny tiny and need something smaller. You with me? So variety is the spice of life. So this translates in a few ways. The first thing is you want to choose flowers of different sizes and colors. Sizes, obviously, because different critters' bodies are different sizes and they need to be able to get into and out of those nectar rewards. And also for larger butterflies, they need a larger surface, generally speaking, on which to land. Colors is what kind of surprised me. I knew that insects saw colors differently from how we see colors as humans, but I didn't realize how differently they see colors from each other. So for example, bees are really, really good at seeing yellows, whites, and purples, but they're not as good at distinguishing red from green. In contrast, butterflies and hummingbirds are particularly attracted to reds. And so again, do I have to memorize which colors attract which critters? No, I simply have to plant a variety of colors and have a variety of colors blooming throughout the year. And the plus side of that is it's darn pretty. I also want to choose flowers with different structures. So we see an example here, tubular flowers, composite, umbelliform, and mallow. So, and by the way, look at those pollen pants on that mama bee there and the mallow flowers. Isn't that cute? Okay. So we want those different shapes because different critters need these different shapes for landing, for sunning, for feeding in particular. Composite flowers, like you see in the middle, are particularly good bang for the buck, and I have quite a few of these in my gardens. So a composite flower consists of what we call, usually has ray petals along the outside, not always. So those are the big ones. And what looks like a single center is not really. It's a bunch of teeny little nectar rewards in the middle, each of which has nectar and pollen. And so I like to equate it with, like, if they were to go to this Turk's cap tubular, it's like going to a freestanding store when they're looking to go shopping. But a composite flower is like going to a shopping mall. They can sit there regardless of the size of the critter and dip their little mouth part into multiple nectar rewards. And so composite flowers are particularly popular, especially with those teeny little insects, which tend to feed on them quite a bit because they can get their shallow mouth parts into those little nectar rewards. So just choose things with different structures. Again, it just looks pretty too. Finally, you want to choose flowers that bloom in different seasons. So the worst thing is the buffet is fully stocked in the spring and summer, but there's nothing around in the fall when the insects have already been nesting there and setting up habitat there, and then there's nothing for them to eat. So all that this means is that when we select plants at the nursery, we need to look at the labels and think about the time of bloom. At the very end of this presentation, I'm going to recommend, I call it like native plants around the seasons, and I'm going to recommend 1 or 2 native plants native to your area in Montgomery County that are easy peasy native plants that bloom in different seasons. And so I'll show you that and tell you a bit about them. But I've also created a chart that Ms. Barnes is going to post after this talk sometime that actually has this with all the information you need about bloom time, water, sunlight, soil, all that kind of stuff. So just make sure that the buffet is stocked all year. Tip 4, pile it up. Okay, so what do I mean by pile it up? So by this, I mean to plant our gardens in clusters of more than one plant and by species. So let me say that again. Plant in clusters by species. Flo Hanna, who has passed away, unfortunately, I never had the honor of meeting her, but she was a huge volunteer and a huge part of the Katy Prairie Conservancy. And she used to always say that planting in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, 7s, just really catches the eye. It's just aesthetically pleasing for some reason. And I follow her rule of thumb. So you can see here, I have Indian blanket or firewheel here. I have multiple plants clustered. Here I have American germander, sort of in an L shape. Texas coneflower and rough coneflower here. This is not native to our area of Texas, but purple coneflower, I've had it for years, and more blanket flower back here. And so there's a biological reason for doing this, and there's an aesthetic reason. So let's talk aesthetics first. So aesthetically, a garden looks more intentional when I plant in clusters. It gives the eye a place to rest aesthetically as it moves across the garden, and it reads intention. So the more that you cluster within a garden bed, the more it reads garden and looks intended. I do have areas that are like a pocket prairie where everything's jumbled together and they are gorgeous. But in those areas, I also make sure I have beefy borders so that it still reads garden. Does that make sense? So that's the aesthetic reason. The biological reasons are that some of our insects, especially some bees, practice what we call flower constancy, which means that they want to feed on the nectar or pollen of the plant in a particular species first before they move to another species. So honeybees are a good example of this, which is one reason why they're really good pollinators, because they kind of focus on species by species. So if I have them in clumps, it makes it easier for them to go shopping. And likewise, as they fly overhead, some butterflies are going to see those colors better if we have clumps of them. This doesn't mean that it has to be literally a clump of one species. You can have combination patches. So in the upper right, I have what we believe is seaside goldenrod, which is native to my area of Texas, and aromatic aster. It's not invasive. It's native to the hill country. I have it too, and I love it, and so do the pollinators. But look how that yellow and purple are there. Those are close complementary colors on the color wheel, meaning opposites. And as I learned in the Native Landscaping Certification Program Level 2, having those opposite colors together creates energy and interest and really draws the eye. So it stands out. And likewise down here, I have Texas coneflower and bee balm, which is Monarda fistulosa, both natives. Again, that purple and yellow. But you could also have colors that are close on the color wheel. I have areas with wine cups, which are a magenta next to blue salvia. And so I have those close to the color wheels, green, purple, and blue together. And that creates, as I learned in that certification class, that creates a very soothing feeling. So you can plant in clusters of patches too. Embrace imperfections, step 5. So the hardest thing for me to do, and this gets to, remember I said at the beginning, how we maintain the garden is part of it. So this is what this is speaking to, embracing imperfection, how we maintain it after we design and install plants. It matters. So the first thing is I want to leave pithy stems and hollow stems from my dead plants in place for a certain amount of time, as well as seed heads. So on the left-hand side and in the middle, you see examples of old stems. Okay, and here's why. About 30% of those native bees that we talked about. So first off, most of our native bees here do not nest in a collective hive. Our bumblebees do, but they're very different. Our other bees, generally speaking, are the majority are very different from honeybees and bumblebees in that they're not what we call social bees. In other words, it's like single mama has a single nesting tube or chamber, okay? And so we call those solitary nesters, and that's the majority of our native bees. And so about 30% of those solitary bees nest above ground. And those that nest above ground might nest in wood like carpenter bees or in little crevices, right? Or might create their own little home like resin bees, or those teeny tiny ones might actually nest inside pithy and hollow stems. And the same is true for some of our teeny tiny native wasps. And so they will actually chew into these mamas will, and they'll lay their eggs in there. Likewise, some of those teeny bees and wasps will overwinter inside those stems. And so when the first freeze comes and I see all these dead stalks around, oh, that little part of me that's obsessive wants to get in there and chop them all down, right? Because it's brown stuff. But I cordially invite you not to. And I don't do that anymore. In fact, I don't do that until I'm ready to plant in the spring, and we've had at least a couple of weeks of weather above 50 degrees or so. And the reason for that is I want to give those bees time to come to hatch and to come out so that I'm not cutting them down and composting them inadvertently. And then after that time, when I do clean up, I still leave about 6 to 12 inches of the stem in place so that over the spring and summer, the next generation of mama bees and wasps can use those stems. So that's just sort of, and as my garden grows out and fills out, it's going to cover those stems anyway. So no one's going to see those after a while. On the right-hand side, you see those seed heads. And so birds and other animals, especially over the winter, will actually feed on those seeds. So whatever I don't harvest or allow to reseed in the garden, I leave there for those critters. Another way to embrace imperfection is to use fallen leaves as mulch. And so in my gardens, I haven't used commercial mulch for years now. And the primary reason for that, y'all, is that the leaves themselves tend to be looser. Now, this is a very thick application. I actually don't, this is from early on. I don't put it this thick anymore usually, but in some areas I do. It's looser, and therefore the 70% of our native solitary bees that nest in the ground as opposed to above ground can still burrow through the leaves to make their nesting tunnels, and their babies can still hatch in the spring. And that may not be true with commercial mulch that's thickly applied. And so I use leaves from my own garden to fill up my garden bed, because critters can get that nest in the ground, like our wasps and bees can get in and out. It's about 70% of our bee species. I also do it because a lot of critters, even some birds and butterflies and amphibians and reptiles, will actually huddle under those leaves, and they will stay warm and protected from the freezes that we have in our area under those leaves. And so I leave those for them as well. And so if you do this, just a couple of pointers. If your covenants and standards don't require it, I would suggest not shredding the leaves before you put them in, because some of our butterfly and moth caterpillars will pupate in the leaves of trees. And then when the trees drop the leaves, they will drop to the ground and still be attached to the leaf. And so if we shred them, we might be shredding those. And also leaving them whole kind of gives that extra protection for the critters underneath. So if your restrictions allow it, then leave them whole. The other thing is I want to make sure that I use leaves from yards that don't use herbicides and pesticides. So if my neighbor uses herbicides and pesticides, I don't want to use leaves from those yards. And finally, I want to avoid those leaves that are from trees that we call allelopathic. So they have chemicals that suppress the growth of other trees. So primarily here it's magnolias. In some areas of the country, it's black walnut. So magnolia leaves I don't want in here because they can exude that kind of chemical that will suppress. And I don't know if pecan leaves are that way. I'm not sure, but you can always check that out. I also want to let my early spring wildflowers go. So this is a conversation I have with my neighbors. They know that there are at least patches in my yard, in my actual lawn, which I don't have much lawn anymore anyway. There are patches that are just gonna go with wildflowers. And the reason for this is these little wildflowers like crow poison that you see up here and the oxalis wood sorrel species, they tend to come up before anything in my garden beds is blooming. Like they're some of the first things to come up. And if I didn't have them, I don't know what my pollinators would eat as they come out of their equivalent of hibernation, which is called diapause. And so it requires just, over a cup of coffee with your neighbors, explaining what you're doing. They'll be flexible if your restrictions allow it. Tip 6, stock the nursery. So remember I told you that about 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, and same is true for a lot of our native wasps. So I want to leave some areas of bare ground. In addition to those stems, I want to leave some areas of bare ground in places that are well drained and sunny, where water doesn't pool, and in areas where I'm not going to go a lot to maintain the garden. I want to leave some of those just plain. So they, sandy, looser soil is a good thing. And what you see here is a mama furrow bee. I caught her going in and out of her ground nest. Isn't that cute as can be? So leave some of that area open if you can for those bees and wasps to nest in. But again, if we don't use commercial mulch, they can get in between our plants and they can get in under our leaf mulch, and they can nest in the ground there too. I have created a handout, by the way, with online resources for every single tip that I'm giving you, or virtually every single tip. And Amber Barnes is going to post it along with the other document I was mentioning before on the website after this talk. And it gives you resources not only for this kind of stuff, but also for those bee boxes that some people use, which frankly, it's better just to give them habitat. But if you want to use bee boxes, it tells you how to do it in a responsible, safe way. And then finally, like Ms. Barnes was mentioning before, with monarchs and planting milkweed, we want to make sure that we stock the nursery by planting those host plants that my caterpillar and my caterpillars of moths and butterflies can feed on. And so you see here just a few examples. Yes, wasps do eat these. So what I have learned in my gardens is that I spread out the host plants. So my milkweed is in about 5 different places in my garden, very far from each other. And that way, if the wasps and lady beetles and other predators and parasitoids find my monarch caterpillars in one area, they won't necessarily find them at all. So I have pretty good success. I mean, most get eaten, but again, other creatures need them to survive as well. But I have pretty good success by spreading things out. Tip 7, know your rights. So by this, I mean that before you start any designing or installing of a wildscape in your area, you need to think about deed restrictions, ordinances, and easements that maybe utility companies have. In the woodlands, you call them covenants and standards. The standards are universal to all of the Woodlands Township. The covenants, there are 2 of them, I think, that are by the location where your home is, where your subdivision is. And so you need to know these well to make sure that you're following their standards when you install these things, because the worst thing is you install and then have to redo it. About October of 2019, I spoke for the Woodlands Township, and I created a chart for that time that had sort of hit the highlights of those covenants and standards that y'all have that related to the tips that I'm giving in this talk. So things like bordering garden beds, placing garden beds, plant choice, right? Things like putting up decorative items to make it look pretty. So those things might be regulated in your area. And so I think that Ms. Barnes is also going to post that document. It was the highlights. So again, always read, the lawyer in me tells you, always read all of your covenants and standards, but that hit the highlights, and I haven't updated it since October 2019, but it'll be posted as a starting point for you. So just think about those. And if you need approval, no big thing, just seek approval. Tip 8, imitate nature. So this comes from that Garden Revolution book that I told you I absolutely adore. So I think the idea that this author has, if I had to sort of put it in a nutshell, is to work with nature instead of against nature, if that makes sense. So one of the tips they gave is, if you've already got native plants that are volunteering on your property, that are already there, then incorporate those by all means into your landscaping, because if they have volunteered, it means they like the conditions in your garden. They like the soil, water, and sun. And so if they're there and if they work for your garden, think about incorporating them. And this means also cataloging what's there before you begin, even if it's just, throwing some things up on iNaturalist, which Amber mentioned, or, checking with a gardening group. You also want to model your plant choices after natural plant communities. And fortunately, really great, the Environmental Services Department in its Plant for Pollinators initiative and the Woodlands Township in general have lists of plants that are native to your area. And they encourage you to have those. So that's a fantastic resource. And those things are linked in that chart that I mentioned that Amber will post on the website later. So use those charts as resources, as starting places, and then look around you. What's growing in the natural areas around you? And if you see native plants there that are thriving, think about putting them in your own garden if it works. Also, to save yourself time, and this is what I've learned over time, I plant my stuff close together. I use native ground covers like Texas frog fruit, Philonodiflora, right? Or creeping spot flower, it's native to my area at least. Or things like some of the fleabanes that look like little fried egg flowers. I use those and I pack them densely. And the reason that I do this is that it suppresses those unwanted weeds. It acts as, I think it's these authors or someone else, it acts as green mulch. So it saves me time. Now that look is not for everyone, but if it is something that you like, then I recommend it. It works great. And finally, embrace and guide succession and change. And what do I mean by this? I mean that if we listen to our gardens, they will tell us where they want to go. So if I see that a native plant that by all my research should work really well in my garden is not working well in my garden, then either I need to rethink having it in my garden or I need to move it to a different part of my garden. So I kind of let the garden tell me what it wants, and then I guide it. And be a good neighbor. I'm going to go for about 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. So my husband, when he's a solo practitioner, we're both attorneys, best part of law school, meeting my husband, I have to admit. We met there our second year. And so my husband is a solo practitioner, and he went out on his own about 11 years ago. And he said, Lauren, you know, I need always to remember that people are not means to an end. They're an end in themselves. But when we're friendly with folks around us, the side benefit of that is that they cut us a lot of slack, and there's a lot of understanding, and they embrace what we do, right? We become friends. So just because of their being humans, we get to know them and we are friendly with them, but the side effect is that they accept things. So as just an example, having been raised in the South here and learning from my mom, every time a new neighbor moved in, she prepared a welcome basket. And so I do the same for everyone who moves in. COVID's been a little different, but I do the same for every neighbor who moves in. I prepare a welcome basket with, you know, I bake some cookies, and it has things like, you know, this is where you can vote, and here's where the dry cleaners is, and here's where the groceries are, and, you know, here's my number if you need anything. And then I include a flyer, which I'll show you in a minute, from our wildlife habitat gardens so that they understand what we do, and I give them some native seeds. And so right there, we start that dialogue. And if they have kids and we become friends, then every time something cool happens in the garden, I text the parents and the kids come over. So the kids come over, they may help me plant bluebonnets. They may see a butterfly eclose or hatch. They may see caterpillars and get to hold them. So getting to know our neighbors, you know, the more you know someone, the more they cut you slack in what you do in your garden. And like I've said, I've literally had no pushback in the 6 years I've done this, because my neighbors get what we're doing and they sort of embrace it. Likewise, I want to keep those neighbors informed. And so this takes two forms. The first form I already mentioned, and that is when something cool happens, I text my friends in the neighborhood and they come by and they look at the cool thing happening. And they and their kids really embrace it and adopt it, and it becomes like their own garden. The other time I do it is when I'm changing something. So when I'm putting in a new garden bed, I just let them know what I'm doing or whatever. So that, or things like when I let those wildflowers go in my lawn, I just have that conversation with them. We also want to involve the community. So I love what Ms. Barnes was saying about how, you know, the Environmental Services Department and the Woodlands Township in these pollinator initiatives, they're focusing not only on the plants in the public areas, but they're focusing on the plants and people in the community as well, and getting the community involved. And so one way to do that is just to host, when COVID is behind us, host gatherings, informal tours. You know, I have people walk by or jog by and they stop and then they take a tour of the garden, you know, or seed and plant swaps. And so you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the photo there, that's from, we did a garden blessing. As you can imagine, naming it our garden St. Julian's Crossing. I'm Catholic, so of course we have to have blessing for everything. So there we are. Boy Scouts came over and learned some stuff. I've had Girl Scout troops come. So just really cool things if it works for you. We also want to give our garden character, of course, in line with our covenants and standards, right? So whatever is pretty to you, if it's tasteful and pretty and shows your personality, then that's great. I always say about the mosaics, that's a lamppost that I mosaicked in the center, and the bottom left is the edge of a garden bed. As the older I get, the more I feel compelled to glue stuff on stuff. It's just my thing. So anyway, however it translates for you. And then finally, and I got this from my friend Jaime Gonzalez back in 2015 when he spoke, really make it look intentional. And again, in the words of my friend, intended rather than untended. Okay, so again, the wilder or more densely filled the garden bed is, the more substantial I want those garden borders to be. So whether it's wood or stone, whatever your standards and covenants allow, I would recommend that if it's thicker and denser inside, or more like a pocket prairie inside, then really beef up those borders. So just a thought there. And then we can also make it look intentional by certifying our garden. You heard Amber mention some of our certifications, and by using those signs. So a lot of these places that nonprofit and private groups that offer these certifications also offer signs. And so my husband set up that little sign thing there. So it's done very tastefully. What you see on the left-hand photo here in front, which is reflected here front and back on the right-hand side, is one of those little real estate flip containers. And in it, I have a flyer. And the flyer tells the story of our gardens with a nutshell version of how we do things. And so this is, again, part of that communicating, right? It's about critters and community. So I'm communicating why our garden looks different. And knowledge leads to acceptance. And on the back, it has a bunch of resources where people can go to have questions answered. Your restrictions, your standards and covenants, some of them do require pre-approval for signs. So I would just read those, but just ask. I think it's a great way to show intending instead of an untended status. And finally, tip 10, have fun. Golly, as Ms. Barnes was saying, just go out there and look at the critters in your garden. I'm out there every time I take a break from teaching and grading. I'm out there for 10, 15 minutes and just, it's such a breath of fresh air, literally and figuratively. Okay, in the last few minutes, before we have questions and answers, I want to talk to you about some native plant choices that bloom. So I'm focusing on flowering plants that are native to your part of Texas in the Woodlands Township, that bloom in particular, that start blooming in different times of the year. And so I'm calling it native flowering plants across the seasons. To learn more about these and other plants, I highly recommend the Native Plant Database. You can see the URL at the bottom, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And they also have really cool plant lists there. So by region, right? By other criteria. So I highly recommend that database. It's fantastic. So here is, again, I have a chart for you that Ms. Barnes is going to post later. It's in PDF format, but here is sort of a graphic view. The sun means full sun. This means part sun or part shade, and the sunglasses mean shade. So I tried to pick a couple of plants for each season that are native, that tend to be set it and forget it. Some of them like wetter feet. Some of them can take drought. Some take sun, some take shade, and many of them are deer resistant, which is a big deal up in Montgomery County. So I wanted to kind of hit all the bases because different people have different environments at their home. So let's just talk for a little bit about each of these things. And again, everything's captured in that chart. So Indian blanket or firewheel, also called blanket flower, is Gaillardia pulchella. Look at these gorgeous bees feeding on it. Again, all of these are from my garden. If I could recommend only one plant, if you have the right environment for it in your yard, oh my gosh, I would recommend this one. So this is one of those composite flowers with all those teeny little nectar sources in the middle, right? You have to have full sun. You've got to have well-drained soil. And this flower loves garbage soil. You see this as you drive in and out of town on the roadsides. It can take clay. It can take sand. It likes rubbish. And pretty much the only way to kill it is to overwater it and to give it too much TLC. So you don't even need to supplement the soil for this stuff, right? Once it's established, the first couple of weeks you install a plant, you have to water it religiously, at least every day. But after that, this is one of the ones I never water, even during the summer. I don't need to. It blooms starting, I've got some blooming fully right now. So they started blooming 2 or 3 weeks ago. And even though it's an annual in the South, like where we are, it'll bloom all the way to November. It dies after that. It's an annual, but it comes back from seed. It's aggressively reseeding. So just understand that once you have it, you always have it. But again, it's a native, doesn't matter if it's aggressive. Then there's scarlet sage, also called tropical sage or blood sage, Salvia coccinea. Look at these gorgeous bees. And even though they're not as good at distinguishing red from green, they know this flower. And they are actually doing what we call nectar robbing, where they pierce the base and suck out the nectar. I love this plant. So this can take full sun to part shade. You need to water it at the height of drought a couple times a week. It wants well-drained soil, but it blooms until the first freeze. And then it comes back from the root and from seed. It is deer resistant. It's in the mint family, so it's deer resistant. This one I don't have on my property, so I relied on my friends for photographs. So this is called buttonbush. It is an amazing pollinator pleaser. This one blooms in the summer. So it wants part shade to full shade, but it takes a lot of water too. It gets really tall, so it's actually a shrub. And it's moderately deer resistant, and a couple of moths will actually lay their eggs on its leaves, and birds feed from its seeds. Another summer bloomer is spotted bee balm or Monarda punctata. Any of the bee balms, the Monarda plants, are really good choices if they're native to your area. So this one wants full sun. Like my blanket flower, my Indian blanket, I don't supplemental water this. I don't need to. It likes sandier soil, and it likes it to be well drained. It aggressively reseeds, but easy to pull out if you don't want it in a certain area. Fantastic pollinator pleaser, especially for wasps and bees, I find. Fall, I love, love, love this plant. It's called blue mist flower. Look at those gorgeous creatures on there. So it can go all the way from full sun to part shade, but I tell you, if you plant it in part shade, it's not going to bloom as vigorously. The more you have it in full sun, the more you have to water it in the heat of the summer. So probably during drought, I hit it at least 2 times a week, sometimes 3, just like my scarlet sage, about 3 times a week in drought. It blooms in the summer through fall, so it's starting to bloom now, but it is most robust in the fall, right as the queen and monarch butterflies are migrating through Houston in the fall. So it's a great source for them. Also, the Liatris species, the gay feather species. So this is prairie blazing star, also called Kansas blazing star. So these come up in stalks of these tiny little purple composite flowers. This one wants full sun, and really I don't water mine, although the sources I was reading say it does like some water. It blooms from the summer to the fall. So this will bloom through about November, like some of the other summer plants will. I think that, yeah, this one will bloom through probably about November as well, the blue mist flower. But butterflies and bees and wasps all love it. And so basically, if you have well-drained soil and full sun, this is a great choice for fall blooming. And then finally, I don't have this yet because I don't have the place for it. Those other fall plants will persist through November. This variety of frostweed supposedly will go through December and the first freeze, but it is a huge nectar source. It can take full sun to light shade, but it does get pretty tall, and it's highly deer resistant, which is good for y'all. So that, my friends, is it. Thank you for sticking with me for 1 hour and 15, and I am happy to take your questions.
All right, Lauren, thank you so much. We do have a few questions, and before we get to those questions, just a reminder, if anyone does have a question, use that chat feature, put it in the box. We will take a look at that. And as Lauren mentioned, there are so many resources that she was able to provide during this presentation. We are going to get those out to you guys. So look for an email from us. We'll make sure that you're getting those resources and you know where to find them. And please be sure to share them. We want to spread word. So if your neighbors couldn't attend or your family and friends missed it, this is being recorded. I will send you guys that link so that you can watch it again. But be sure, please, please, please share this. We need to get those stepping stones created, right? So as Lauren said, there's a lot of work to do. So let's take a look at a couple of questions we have. Lauren, one of our participants said that they have a lot of Korean mint growing in their yards, and it kind of grew on their own. So from what they've read, they're not invasive. And they attract a lot of bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. Are you familiar with this plant, and are you familiar with its attraction for pollinators?
So I'm not actually, but I do know that some of the mints that my husband and I, so we tend to grow them in pots. They do volunteer, right? But we tend to grow them in pots for the reason that they do spread. I stole them pretty quickly. But I have seen, just anecdotally, seen critters feeding on the flowers. I don't know this particular species, and so I can't really speak to it very much.
I was gonna say, personally, I have a lot of mint, and there's always something on it as soon as a flower pops up. So again, if there's concerns about a plant being invasive, and Lauren, you mentioned a great list, and we'll make sure we get those resources out to everyone. We did have a few questions asking for lists of invasives. We did put a resource in the chat for you. Please take the time to try and identify the plants that are in your yard. You may be surprised or learn something. As Lauren said, sometimes you don't know until you get in there and start identifying those plants. So we'll share some resources on some invasives. There is a invasives task force that the Woodlands has, which is a volunteer force that goes out and does remove invasives from green spaces. We also put information about that in the chat feature. So if you're interested in learning identification and best removal practices, reach out to the Environmental Services Department and we can get you guys more information about invasives. Someone asked, how do you mix herbs and wildflowers? You did mention some of those herbs in your talk earlier.
That's a great question. So the great thing about herbs is that they are delicious and they also can support the eggs of certain butterflies, right? So just depending on how much sun or what kind of soil they need or how much water they need, I just intersperse them as if they were one of my native pollinator plants. I just intersperse them. And so I have one of my favorites, by the way, is African blue basil. It's a hybrid of the basils. And the reason I like this one so much is it blooms from now, actually a few weeks ago, all the way through the first freeze when it dies back. And you never have to pinch off the flower heads to promote growth. Like a lot of basil, if you don't pinch off those flower heads, it'll go to seed. This one does not. So I love African blue basil, and I have it in multiple places around my garden. It can take part shade all the way to full sun. And I just incorporate where I think it's going to be pretty and where I think it will do well. I also have dill, fennel, and parsley. Those are plants in the carrot family. Again, they're not native to here, but they're not invasive. We use them for cooking, but always check to make sure there's no eggs on them. And we also have rue, which is not really an edible, but that is used by the giant swallowtail butterfly as well as the eastern black swallowtail. And the eastern black swallowtails will use all those other ones in the carrot family that I mentioned. So I just sprinkle them throughout, wherever I think they're going to look pretty.
Perfect. Great question, Lauren. And for any of those who may follow the township's environmental services blog, we actually just wrote an article about spicing up your pollinator garden by adding some herbs and what butterflies will lay eggs and caterpillars will look for those plants. So if you don't follow our blog, be sure to head over to the Woodlands Township website. We just highlighted some of those herbs for pollinators. So great timing. Another question, Lauren, they're just asking for your thoughts on trumpet vine.
So is trumpet vine the one with the big white flowers that hangs down?
So kind of like an orange flower. It's very prominent in the township area. So you'll see it on a lot of those, that upper canopy just growing all over the place.
I gotcha. So, so it depends, right? So I know that like many vines, if I'm understanding right, it's So it tends to be very assertive and spreads very quickly. So a lot of them are hybrids. I used to have a hybrid one on a trellis in my gardens, but I've since removed it and I've replaced it with another kind of vine called coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens, which is fantastic. I didn't even cover it during the freeze. It didn't need to be covered. And it happens to be native and it's just as assertive as the other. So, you know, I don't know if anyone listed as an invasive. If it's not an invasive and it's beautiful and it gives you joy, by all means keep it. But if it is one of those things that ends up being it turns out to be an invasive, or if you would like more bang for the buck by having a native that might also be the host plant for some other critters, then you could always remove it and replace it with one of our natives. Another good resource for finding plants by, and I think you list this, Amber, on the Environmental Resources Pollinator Initiative site, but the Native Plant Society of Texas Houston chapter has a native plant list and it breaks things up. So it has native plant vines, native trees, native shrubs, native shade loving plants, native sun plants, native hummingbird and pollinator plants. And so they have a lot of options for vines that you could use if you're looking to substitute. But I don't know enough about trumpet vines, kind of generic, and I don't know what species we're talking about. So I can't speak specifically to that. Sorry.
That brings up a good reminder, Lauren. Some of our participants were here for that earlier portion where we had someone from Woodlands Water speaking, and there are a number of plant lists out there. So if you are buying native plants and you're looking at some of those plant lists, be sure to check out Woodlands Water Agency's native plant list because they actually have a rebate program. So if you are a resident who's serviced by Woodlands Water Agency, you can purchase those native plants and get a rebate on your water bill. So there are a lot of resources. Like Lauren said, we do have several on our website, and we'll make sure that we update those and include those in emails going out. I think we might have, let's see here, one more question, Lauren. And if any guidance, we have someone who is looking for a resource of landscapers. So if you're someone who is unable to do the work yourself, I don't know if you have anyone that you could recommend, but maybe how would you go about, or what questions could you ask to make sure that you're getting someone who understands your goal in converting to a native landscape?
Right. So that's okay. So that's a great question. So the demand is high and the number who do it are few, right? So I think you need to have a conversation with anyone you hire about not only what their experience is in this, but then a conversation about, are they willing to research it and to figure it out? Does that make sense? Make sure that they test for that kind of willingness. I think that although NPSOT Houston chapter is not endorsing anyone, of course, I think that that native plant resource list may have some folks in the greater Houston area who do at least sell native plants and may also be landscapers. I have used someone on my own who is just starting her own business. It's a side business, not her main job, and she did great work for me. And I can mention that, or I can just say that folks can email me and I will put my email address in and I can give you an idea so that you can interview. There are a couple places, one place beyond that I've heard of, but I have no experience. And so what I think I'd be comfortable with is just let me type in, when we're done, I'm going to type in hold on. This is what I get for not being a touch typist. Okay, there we go. And I'm happy to share the names of those people. I think what we're going to start seeing is we're going to see more of this. And by the way, I also know of several places that are small businesses that are just starting to sell these things in my area. I'm sure you have the same up in Montgomery County as well. So there is an increased demand and people are starting to do that. And I would say one last thing, Amber, speaking of demand, like the last time I checked, we're in a free market society, right? And so this means if you go into a nursery and you don't see the species that you want, then find a manager and have a nice conversation and say, hey, if you could get X, Y, and Z in, I would purchase it. The more conversations that people have with them, the more they will be able to say, wow, I think we have enough demand to pass that on to our producers. It's often what my experience has been in that these native plant places want to sell it. It's just that their producers and suppliers don't grow it often because it's just a wildflower. It's like, well, but that gives them data to talk to their suppliers. And then their suppliers will start carrying it. So you know the places up in Montgomery County, just like I know the places down here in Houston, have those conversations. And I think that's going to, when they see there's the demand, I think that's what's going to be the change.
Couldn't have said it better, Lauren. I think that's a great way to end it.